circuits. When was the last time you saw public lecture circuits that were popular to the tune of thousands and thousands of people? I saw the ones that you and Sam Harris did on YouTube, and Sam's doing them with a lot of other people as well. You're doing them with a lot of other people, with Dave Rubin as well. These are, this is a very unique thing.
That's for sure.
And also this desire to understand new paths of behavior and patterns of thinking, and that these are corrective paths and patterns that can lead you to a more fulfilled and happier life. And recognize the pitfalls of certain types of behavior that people just fall into. And I think oftentimes the difference between someone who lives a fulfilled life and someone who lives a life filled with disaster is following incorrect patterns and not knowing what the correct ones are. So there's a lot of good people out there that live shitty lives, and they don't do it because they're just dumb or because they're bad. They do it because they've been influenced by certain patterns. They've fallen into patterns, whether it's because of the people that they surround themselves with, or the neighborhood they grew up, the people that are around them have this way of being, and they kind of fall into that, or it's drugs or it's alcohol or whatever it is. But then they find a new one. And then they can slide right into that new one. And all of a sudden, they feel energized when they wake up in the morning instead of hungover. They're getting exercise in. They're eating healthy. They're starting to think about things correctly and do good things. And the momentum of them doing those good things leads them to feel good about themselves and energized. And these are all things that you promote and that I think are genuinely really significant, like really important. The thing is, it gets maligned. You get pushed into this weird. But what we were talking about before the podcast, by a small select group of people. It's a very small but vocal minority that wants to misrepresent you. And then there's the periphery that listen to this small group, and then they sort of parrot those words out without any real thinking about what you've said.
Well, one of the things that I have made a mistake about in the past that I just realized in the last couple of weeks was that, people often accuse me and they say, well, most of the people that listen to you are men. And I think, when you're accused like that, your automatic response is, well, you wouldn't be accused if you weren't doing something wrong. So there must be something wrong about that. It's like, why isn't it 50% women? And so I've said things like, well, 80% of the people who watch YouTube videos are men. And so the fact that 80% of the people who watch my videos are men isn't that surprising given that base rate. But then about 3 weeks ago, I started thinking, well, what the hell am I doing? It's like, is there something wrong with talking to men? Is that actually a problem? It's like I didn't set out to do that specifically, but if that's the way it's working out, and there is a majority of men coming to my shows, say, then why is that all of a sudden supposed to be a bad thing? I'm asking men to be more honest, and especially in their speech and their thinking, and to be more responsible for themselves and for their family and for their community, and to grow up and to shoulder their burden and to live a responsible and meaningful life, and putting those two things together conceptually. And it's like, and then there's an accusation about that as if there's something wrong. And I thought, well, why am I even playing into this? It's like, fine, I'm talking to men. I'm encouraging them. And I am absolutely thrilled. Like every time someone comes up to me, and that's happening maybe 100 times a week or something like that, and tells me one of these stories about how they put their life together. It's like, I'm absolutely thrilled about that. And so I don't see, it's just a sign of how pathological our times have become in some sense, that there would have been any guilt about that to begin with. Because how is that not a good thing, man?
It's weird. I think a lot of that has to do with this concept that men are running everything and that men have this massive advantage. There's a white male advantage and privilege that we all enjoy and share, and that men have this advantage financially. There's disparity in terms of the gender gap in pay, and in income. And that if you were really a good person, you would be trying to balance that out, and that you wouldn't be trying to pump up the winning team.
Right, well, and that's the funny thing. Well, that's it, and that's part of that narrative that, well, if there's winners, there has to be losers, and the reason that there are losers is because there's winners. And that's complete bloody nonsense, because as far as I'm concerned, and I really believe this, is that every single person who sets out to put themselves together ethically is a net positive to everyone around them. There's no downside to that. And my book has been criticized by people who've read it very poorly, especially chapter 1, when I talk about hierarchies, that I'm somehow supporting the idea that power in a hierarchy is the right way to be. And there's absolutely nothing in what I've written that suggests that at all. Like, I'm suggesting that human hierarchies are very complex, and that the way that you win in a human hierarchy is by being competent and reciprocal. And so, I mean, for example, even if you're selfish, let's say, you got to think very carefully about what that would mean if you were selfish and awake, because you have to work to take care of yourself and what you want, say, in this moment. But then there's you tomorrow, and there's you next week, and there's you next month and next year and 10 years from now and when you're old. So because you're self-conscious and because you're aware of the future, you're actually a community unto yourself. And if you're selfish and impulsive, all that means is that you're serving the person you are right now, you know, in that impulsive way, but not the person you're going to be. And so that's not a good grounds for any sort of ethical behavior. And I see that if you serve yourself properly, there's no difference between that and serving your family properly and serving your community properly, that those things all mesh in a kind of a harmonious manner. And one of the things that's really been effective in the lecture tour is a discussion about that idea and its relationship between that and meaning and responsibility, because one of the things that strikes the audience as silent constantly, because I'm always listening to them to see, you know, when the attention is maximally focused, is whenever I point out to people that the antidote to the meaninglessness of their life and the suffering and the malevolence that they might be displaying because they're resentful and bitter about how things have turned out, the antidote to that is to take on more responsibility for themselves and for other people, and that's aspirational, which is kind of cool. You know, the conservative types, the duty types, and I'm not complaining about them, you know, they're always basically saying, well, this is how you should act, because in some sense that's your duty, right? That's how a good citizen would act. And that's a reasonable argument. But the case that I've been making is more that, well, there is value distinctions between things. Some things are worth doing and some things aren't, and you can kind of discover what that is for yourself, and then you should aim at the things that are most worth doing. And what you'll find if you watch carefully is that the things that you find worth doing are almost always associated with an increase in responsibility. Because if you think about the people you admire, for example, you spontaneously admire people, and that's a manifestation of the instinct to imitate. Again, people are very imitative. You don't admire people who don't take care of themselves. Like, unless there's something wrong with you, you at least want an admirable person to be accountable for themselves. And then if they've got something left over so they can be accountable for their family, well, then that's a net plus, obviously. That's someone you think is solid. And then maybe they take care of some more people. They have a business or they're involved in the community in some positive way. You see, well, that's a person whose pattern of being is worth imitating. And that's all associated with responsibility. And it's so interesting because it's as if everybody kind of knows this, but that it hasn't crystallized. It's like, well, you should be responsible because that's what a good citizen is. It's not, no, you should be responsible because you need to have a deep meaning in your life to offset the suffering so you don't get bitter. And the way you do that is to bear a heavy load, you know, to get yourself in check for you now and for you in the future, and then to do the same for your family and your community, and that there's real nobility in that, and there's real meaning. And more, the other thing that I've been suggesting to people, and I also believe this, is that, and I think that the guys that have come to talk to me, especially the ones that have had real rough lives, they really understand this. If you don't get your act together and you let yourself slide, then what kind of moves in to take the place of what you could have been is something that's really not good at all. So it's not only that if you're living like a dissolute life, that you're not aiming at anything positive, and so you don't have any real meaning, and you're subsumed by anxiety and all of that and hopelessness, but something kind of hellish moves in there too to occupy that place, and so then you end up making things worse. And when, you know, one of the things I learned about studying totalitarian systems, whether they were on the right or the left, was that part of the reason that the totalitarian horrors of the 20th century manifested themselves was because average people didn't take on the proper responsibility. They shut their eyes when their eyes should have been open, even though they knew it. And they did and said things they knew they shouldn't have done and said. And that was what supported those horrible systems. So, you know, if you don't get your act together, then you leave a little space for hell. And I really believe that.
Don't you think when things are happening, like something like Nazi Germany, I would imagine that during that time, the people that were not in support of it felt helpless, whether you're in Germany, you're a part of this country. This country is turning towards this horrible situation where Jewish people are being put on trains, and the people that didn't speak out in that, I don't necessarily know if it's a lack of discipline or just complete fear and paralysis
it's a fear for sure. I mean,
knowledge of how to deal with it or what
disbelief
to do, and
too,
wanting to protect your family as well, so not wanting to step out of line.
Absolutely. That's the problem is that if you're going to forestall that sort of thing, you have to do it early. Because the longer you wait, the higher the price you pay for it.
But isn't it it's hard to take that jump early because you're not exactly sure where it's going?
That's true. And you're also likely to be jumped on.
Yes.
I mean, you can see that happening in our own culture. You make a mistake on Twitter or even something that isn't a mistake, and you can pay what feels to be a pretty high price. Right. Now, whether it is a high price or not is hard to tell because Twitter is so weirdly fictional. It's so hard to get a grasp on exactly what's going on.
Well, it's also your comprehension of what is your emotional reaction to people that you don't know being mean to you. Like this is what is that price?
Well,
and some people want to dismiss that as being just nothing. It's not that big a deal, but it is a big deal. It causes people to commit suicide. I mean, it has absolutely. Bullying online has caused many people to commit suicide.
Well, the thing is, when you the weird thing about that online communication is that, like, I find that I tend to react to a negative Twitter comment as if it's someone sitting across from me talking to me that I know. Mm-hmm. Now, it's not, and I don't even know if the person is real because the accounts are often anonymous, right? So that person isn't really real. But your emotional response is still, someone's gone out of their way to be harshly critical to you.
Right.
And that doesn't happen that often in your day-to-day life. And so, if you're a reasonable person, you're very sensitive to criticism because it's rare and because you might be wrong, especially if there's a lot of people criticizing you, because you kind of have to be psychopathic in order just to brush that off. It's like, 100 people think I'm wrong. There's nothing to that. It's like, if it's 100 people out of 100 million, but you can't tell on Twitter, then it's irrelevant. But if it's a mob of 100 people that show up outside your house, which is quite kind of what Twitter feels like, then you think, God, I must have done something wrong because otherwise why would all these people be here?
Right.
And I think that's why so many people are driven to apologize, when they do something on Twitter or do something and then the Twitter mobs go after them, they think, oh God, I must have done something wrong. I should do some soul searching. And so some of that's not even fear. It's more like, it's in a sense, it's a morality that's misplaced because of our inability to calibrate the social messaging. I mean, I've almost completely stopped reading Twitter comments in the last month. And I'm definitely better for it.
Yeah, it makes you way happier, right?
Oh yeah, it's too much. It's too much.
Crazy.
It's too crazy.
Well, what is your number up to now? The number of followers you
have?
About
1 million on Twitter.
Yeah, that's when it's about time to get out of Dodge.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I'm still following people and reading what people are posting, but no, the comments, I'm just
not worth it.
No, it's not. And I think it does have something to do with the technology itself. Like, I do believe that small limit facilitates angry, impulsive responding.
Perhaps because you're trying to get people to respond to you, but the alternative is Facebook, where you have these long posts that are just rambling first drafts that people put out. Like when they start ranting about politics or what have you, I just can't get involved. They're just too big. And then people jump in and comment on them, and often their comments are massive as well. It's just too verbose. Whereas the good thing about Twitter is it makes you boil down what you're trying to say to a very succinct thing. Although I do enjoy when someone has a good Twitter thread. Like there was a really good Twitter thread. What was that gentleman's name? Respectable Lawyer?
Respectable Law.
Respectable Law. He wrote a long history of the Sentinelese people that's that uncontacted tribe in the Indian Sea, where this gentleman went there to try to convert them to Christianity, and he shot him full of arrows. Yeah, and he wrote this long history of these people and what they've had to endure with being, a few people going to them and doing some awful things and diseases and stuff like that. So I enjoy when someone will do that, like these long, like every now and then someone will use it in a novel way. I really like that. But there's, a lot of it is just people just trying to get a reaction, and what's the reaction they can get by pissing you off? That's like the best one.
Well, they almost
Insulting
might
you.
be the ones that are most we don't exactly know what motivates people
Grandma, you weren't invited.
That's the best kind of party, little girl.
On DVD and Blu-ray now.
to respond on Twitter, and it might be that the fundamental motivation for a Twitter response is anger.
Yeah.
Rather than the desire to share something, because we don't know anything about how these new communication techniques function psychologically.
Right.
Like maybe Twitter is skewed 90% towards people who are impulsively angry at that moment. It could easily be. We don't know. Like, if you're driving in your car and someone cuts you off, you curse, or at least I do. And it's often a situational issue rather than a personality flaw on the part of the other driver, even though it's easy to assume that. But you respond impulsively. I mean, God only knows how much of our social media networks are set up to differentially reward impulsive behavior. And it's also not that easy to hold people accountable in some sense. And maybe there's some utility to that, but with anonymous accounts and all of that, the anonymity is also problematic because it certainly enables people to allow their worst to manifest themselves, especially if they're resentful and angry. So
the only benefit that I can see to anonymity is it gives you the opportunity to explore controversial ideas without blowback.
True.
If it's used correctly.
Well, that's it. I think that's true. I think there's some utility. I mean, I don't think that it should be forbidden, but well, like most things, it has its advantages and its disadvantages.
Yeah, like most things. It's not entirely negative to be anonymous.
Hey, so I figured something out that I thought I'd tell you about. This took me like 30 years to figure out, and I figured it out on this tour. So there's this old idea, that you have to rescue your father from the belly of the whale, right? From some monster that's deep in the abyss. You see that in Pinocchio, for example. But it's a very common idea. And I figured out why that is, I think. So imagine that we already know from a clinical perspective that, if you set out a path towards a goal, which you want to do because you need a goal and you need a path, because that provides you with positive emotion, right? So you set up something as valuable, so that implies a hierarchy. You set up something as valuable. You decide that you're going to do that instead of other things, so that's kind of a sacrifice because you're sacrificing everything else to pursue that. And then you experience a fair bit of positive emotion and meaning as you watch yourself move towards the goal. And so the implication of that is the better the goal, the more full and rich your experience is going to be when you pursue it. So that's one of the reasons that's one of the reasons for developing a vision and for fleshing yourself out philosophically, because you want to aim at the highest goal that you can manage. Okay, so you do that, and then what you'll find is that as you move towards the goal, there are certain things that you have to accomplish that frighten you. Maybe you have to learn to be a better speaker, a better writer, a better thinker, or you have to be better to people around you, or you have to learn some new skills and you're afraid of that, whatever, because it's going to stretch you if you pursue a goal, and so that'll put you up against challenges. Okay, so all the clinical data indicates, well, the opposite of safe spaces, as Jonathan Haidt has been pointing out, that what you want to do when you identify something that someone is avoiding that they need to do because they're afraid, you have them voluntarily confront it. And so you break it down. What you try to do if you're a behavior therapist is you break down the thing they're avoiding into smaller and smaller pieces until you find a piece that's small enough so they'll do it. And it doesn't really matter as long as they start it. Then they can put the next piece on and the next piece. And what happens is they don't get less afraid exactly. They get braver. They get it's like there's more of them. And here's why. So imagine you do something new, and that's informative, right? There's information in the action, and then you can incorporate that information and turn it into a skill and turn it into a transformation of your perceptions. So there's more to you because you've tried something new. So that's one thing. But the second thing is, and there's good biological evidence for this now, that if you put yourself in a new situation, then genes code for new proteins and build new neural structures and new nervous system structures. Same thing happens to some degree when you work out, right? Because your muscles are responding to the load, but your nervous system does that too. So you imagine that there's a lot of potential you locked in your genetic code. And then if you put yourself in a new situation, then the stress, that's the situational stress that's produced by that particular situation, unlocks those genes and then builds new parts of you. And so that's very cool, because who knows how much there is locked inside of you. Okay, so now here's the idea. So let's assume that scales as you take on heavier and heavier loads. That more and more of you get more and more informed because you're doing more and more difficult things, but more and more of you gets unlocked. And so then what that would imply is that if you got to the point where you could look at the darkest things, so that would be the abyss, right? That would be the deepest abyss. If you could look at the harshest things, like the most brutal parts of the suffering of the world and the malevolence of people and society, if you could look at that straight and directly, that would